Hello, second graders. It's time for another book. It's our friend. We've already read 2 books about him, and now we have a third. That's right, Johnny Appleseed. We know the story, about John Chapman, but this is just a different interpretation, a different kind of story about the same person, and I'm excited to read it.
It says, Johnny Appleseed, a tall tale retold and illustrated by Stephen Kellogg.
What is a tale? What do they mean by tall tale? Johnny Appleseed. We talked a little bit about a tale and a legend and a folk tale. What makes Johnny Appleseed a folk tale and a legend? Well, if you had time to think and you can remember, a legend is a story that surrounds somebody. So not all the tales and the stories about Johnny Appleseed are 100% accurate, but they do tell a little bit more about who he was, and they become so famous that that's what people talk about. Okay, page 1. I'll have to have it like this so I can see the book.
John Chapman, who later became known as Johnny Appleseed, was born on September 26, 1774. When the apples on the trees surrounding his home in Leominster, Massachusetts, were as red as the autumn leaves. John's first years were hard. His father left the family to fight in the Revolutionary War, and his mother and his baby brother both died before his 2nd birthday.
Wow, I didn't know that from the other 2 books we read. Whew, here is a busy picture. I'll let you look at it.
By the time John turned 6, his father had remarried and settled in Longmeadow, Massachusetts. Within a decade, their little house was overflowing with 10 more children.
Now, we talked a little bit about a decade. How many years is a decade? The answer is 10. So within 10 years, he had 10 more children in his house.
Nearby was an apple orchard. Like most early American families, the Chapmans picked their apples in the fall, stored them in the cellar for winter eating, and used them to make sauces, cider, vinegar, and apple butter. John loved to watch the spring blossoms slowly turn into the glowing fruit of autumn. Watching the apples grow inspired in John a love of all of nature. Ooh, we already know that. He loved the outdoors, he loved wilderness, and he loved creatures big and small. Do you remember the small creatures he liked? In that other book we read? Mosquitoes. And what's the larger creature we have here? That looks like a baby deer, which would be called a fawn. The animals sensed his gentleness and trusted him. How is he being gentle? As soon as John was old enough to leave home, he set out to explore the vast wilderness to the west. When he reached the Allegheny Mountains, he cleared a plot of land and planted a small orchard with the pouch of apple seeds he carried with him. John walked hundreds of miles through the Pennsylvania forests, living like the Indians he befriended on the trail. As he traveled, he cleared the land for many more orchards. He was sure the pioneer families would be arriving before long, and he looked forward to supplying them with apples. Oh, here he is talking with some Native Americans. Remember the pioneers, the first people, kind of the settlers, to move out west. When a storm struck, he found shelter in a hollow log or built a lean-to. On clear nights, he stretched out under the stars. He doesn't sleep in a bed. He's outside in the wilderness. Over the next years, John continued to visit and care for his new orchards. The winters slowed him down, but he survived happily on the diet of butternuts and other foods. Oh, there he is in a little warm cave shelter. Interesting. One spring, he met a band of men who boasted that they could lick their weight in wildcats. So boasted means they're kind of bragging and saying, I could do this, I could do that. And lick their weight in wildcats, that means they're going hunting and see how many they could get. They were amazed to hear that John wouldn't hurt an animal and had no use for a gun. They challenged John to compete at wrestling, the favorite frontier sport. He suggested a more practical contest, a tree chopping match. The woodsmen agreed eagerly. I can do this, I can do that. Chop, 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 chop. Oh, a little friendly competition. When the sawdust settled, there was no questions about who had came on top. John was pleased that the land for his largest orchard had been so quickly cleared. He thanked the exhausted woodsmen for their help and began planting. During the next few years, John continued to move westward. Whenever he ran out of apple seeds, he hiked to the eastern cider presses to replenish his supply. Oh, remember when they were going to the cider presses and he was getting seeds in the other book? Before long, John's plantings were spreading across the state of Ohio. Meanwhile, pioneer families were arriving in search of home sites and farmland. John had located his orchards on the routes he thought they'd be traveling. As he had hoped, the settlers were eager to buy his young trees. Now, why would somebody moving out there with all their belongings want to buy a tree? And why would they want to buy an apple tree? Think about that. Well, hope you had a minute to give your answer. But I think that they're going to take these apple trees and plant them for a food source. Remember, they can store these apples over winter and eat them when it's cold outside. So those people say, whoa, that's a way to make my own food, and they're going to want those. John went out of his way to lend a helping hand to his new neighbors. Often he would give him trees away. People affectionately called him Johnny Appleseed, and he began using that name. He particularly enjoyed entertaining children with tales of his wilderness adventures and the stories from the Bible. Ooh, here he is telling tons of stories. In 1812, the British incited the Indians to join them in another war against the Americans. The settlers feared that Ohio would be invaded from Lake Erie. It grieved Johnny that his friends were fighting each other. Grieved means it made him sad, because he's really not about fighting. But when he saw the smoke of burning cabins, he ran through the night, shouted a warning at every door. After the war, people urged Johnny to build a house and settle down. He replied that he lived like a king in his wilderness home. He returned to the forest he loved. During the long absences, folks enjoyed sharing their recollections of Johnny. They retold his stories, and sometimes they even exaggerated them a bit. How is she exaggerating this story about this with using this apple in the story? Now, this is kind of a thought bubble or an image, how she's doing it. Exaggerating. In her story, look at the size of Johnny's apple. It's huge, humongous. I don't think it was that big. And that's how these stories, these tales that we tell, get to be tall tales. They are stretching the truth a little bit, adding a bit more. Have you ever exaggerated before? I know I have. Some recalled Johnny sleeping in a treetop hammock and chatting with the birds. Chat, chat, chat. La, 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 la. Others remember that a rattlesnake had attacked his foot. Fortunately, Johnny's feet were as tough as elephant's hide, so the fangs didn't penetrate. He's saying, "No problem, Mr. Snake." It was said that Johnny had once tended a wounded wolf and then kept him for a pet. An old hunter swore he'd seen Johnny frolicking with a bear family. A man of the woods, huh? The storytellers outdid each other with the tall tales about his feats of survival in the untamed wilderness. Take a minute and pause on this and see, what do you see? All sorts of stories that people are telling and maybe exaggerating. As the years passed, Ohio became too crowded for Johnny. He moved to the wilds of Indiana, where he continued to clear land for his orchards. When the settlers began arriving, Johnny recognized some of the children who had listened to his stories. Now they had children of their own. It made Johnny's old heart glad when they welcomed him as a beloved friend and asked him to hear his tales again. When Johnny passed 70, it became difficult for him to keep up with his work. Then, in March of 1845, while trudging through a snowstorm near Fort Wayne, Indiana, he became ill for the first time in his life. Johnny asked for shelter in a settler's cabin, and a few days later, he died there. Curiously, Johnny's stories continued to move westward without him. Folks maintained that they'd seen him in Illinois, or that they greeted him in Missouri, Arkansas, or Texas. Others were certain that he planted trees on the slopes of the Rocky Mountains, or in California's distant valleys. Even today, people still claim they've seen Johnny Appleseed. And that's that. Thank you for listening.